There is something I need you to pay very close attention to today, because the emotional landscape surrounding your relationships is standing at the edge of a profound turning point. And I genuinely believe many people are going to overlook just how significant this moment truly is. If you have felt an unusual stirring inside your heart, an unexplainable sense that the old way of loving is no longer sustainable, that feeling is not random. It is arriving for a reason. Today, on August 6th, Venus, the celestial force associated with love, attraction, intimacy, beauty, and the countless invisible threads that connect one human soul to another, moves into Libra. This is not an ordinary change of signs. Libra is the sign Venus naturally governs. It is the place where the qualities of this planet are expressed with their greatest clarity and strength. So when Venus crosses into Libra today, it is not simply changing locations in the sky. It is returning to the environment where its true nature can operate without restraint. That single movement begins a chain of emotional revelations that may completely transform the way you experience relationships over the coming weeks. I am not saying this to create unnecessary excitement. I am saying it because the astrological patterns unfolding throughout this month are exceptionally rare in the way they interact with one another. During the span of only a few weeks, Venus will encounter direct tension with Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, and Saturn, each representing enormous psychological and spiritual forces that influence how we evolve. At the very same time, a solar eclipse and a lunar eclipse surround this entire sequence, creating an atmosphere where endings and beginnings become impossible to separate. The emotional field is being compressed from every direction, almost as if life itself refuses to allow anyone to continue pretending that everything is fine when it clearly is not. While studying these alignments, one particular moment kept drawing my attention back again and again. Around August 21st, there is a specific transit that, in my view, has the potential to become the defining crossroads for countless relationships. It carries the feeling of a moment where the future of a connection may become unmistakably clear, yet surprisingly few people seem to be discussing it. Later in this video, I will explain why I believe the transit deserves far more attention than it is receiving, because understanding it could change the way you approach everything that follows. Before we reach that point, however, we need to understand what begins today. There are 5 distinct shifts unfolding in your love life throughout this month, and the very first one starts the instant Venus enters Libra. It begins with something that has quietly shaped your relationships for much longer than you may realize, and suddenly you will no longer be able to ignore it. The habit of giving too much is about to feel emotionally impossible to carry. To understand why this happens, we need to look at where Venus has been before today. For the past several weeks, Venus has traveled through Virgo. Virgo expresses love through action, responsibility, and service. It often encourages people to care for others by solving problems, offering practical support, fixing what is broken, anticipating needs before anyone speaks them aloud, and constantly trying to become useful in the lives of the people they love. At first glance, there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, it can appear deeply admirable. Being dependable, generous, thoughtful, and consistently available are qualities many people value. Yet every energy carries a hidden side when it remains unbalanced for too long. The shadow of Virgo in relationships appears when love slowly becomes something that must be earned, instead of something that can simply be received. Without even noticing, you begin measuring your worth by how much you sacrifice. You become the one who always adjusts, always compromises, always understands, always forgives, always gives another chance. You convince yourself that if you continue proving your devotion through endless effort, eventually the relationship will become balanced on its own. Somewhere along that journey, however, a painful question quietly disappears. You stop asking whether anyone is meeting your needs with the same dedication you offer theirs. Instead, you continue pouring your emotional energy outward, because giving has become the language through which you learn to feel accepted. If that description touches something deep inside you, I want you to stay with this feeling. Because what happens next matters. The pattern you have carried can no longer continue without demanding your attention. As Venus arrives in Libra today, the emotional atmosphere changes dramatically. Libra does not celebrate endless self-sacrifice. Libra does not glorify relationships where one person carries the entire emotional weight while the other simply receives. Libra is represented by the scales for a reason. Its deepest purpose is balance, fairness, reciprocity, and mutual respect. Under this influence, your awareness becomes much sharper. You may suddenly notice conversations that leave you emotionally exhausted, responsibilities that only seem to belong to you, affection that flows in one direction instead of both. What once felt manageable may begin to feel surprisingly heavy. The imbalance that you previously explained away or minimized can become impossible to ignore, because your body itself starts recognizing what your mind has been trying not to acknowledge. This realization may arrive almost physically. It can feel like tension in your chest, a tightening in your stomach, or an overwhelming emotional certainty that something has been unequal for much longer than you admitted to yourself. If that happens, please understand what it does not mean. It does not mean you have suddenly become selfish. It does not mean you are losing your compassion. It does not mean gratitude has disappeared from your heart. Instead, it may be the universe restoring your ability to recognize your own value after a long period of forgetting it. Many people watching this have become experts at protecting everyone else's comfort, while quietly abandoning their own. Perhaps you have become the peacekeeper in every disagreement. Perhaps you smile and say everything is fine because creating conflict feels more frightening than carrying disappointment. Perhaps you have swallowed emotions so many times that silence has become your default response. Venus entering Libra begins dissolving that pattern. Remaining quiet simply to preserve an unequal situation may start feeling emotionally unbearable. You could experience a powerful desire to finally express what you need instead of constantly translating everyone else's needs into your responsibility. You may find yourself wanting to renegotiate the emotional agreements that have quietly governed your relationships for months or even years. You may hear yourself saying words that once felt impossible, words like, "I need more than this. I deserve to be met halfway. I cannot continue carrying this alone." Those statements are not signs of failure. They are signs that your heart is remembering what healthy love actually requires. This matters because the relationships capable of growing after this transition cannot fully enter a life already overflowing with one-sided obligations. Before something more balanced can arrive, the space occupied by imbalance must first be recognized. Something has to change so something healthier can finally take root. That realization naturally opens the door to the second transformation unfolding this month. Because once your eyes become capable of recognizing unequal dynamics, another question rises almost immediately. You begin wondering why similar people keep appearing in your life. Why familiar disappointments seem to repeat themselves with different faces, and why certain emotional patterns refuse to disappear no matter how much effort you invest. That deeper answer begins revealing itself on August 7th, only one day after Venus enters Libra, when Venus immediately encounters a tense aspect with Chiron. That is where the next layer of this story begins. The energy arriving on August 7th does not gently invite you to reflect. It places a mirror directly in front of the part of yourself you have spent years avoiding, and once that reflection appears, pretending not to see it becomes almost impossible. This is the day Venus forms a quincunx with Chiron, and to understand why that matters so deeply, you first have to understand what Chiron represents in astrology. Chiron is often described as the wounded healer because it carries the emotional imprints that were formed long before you consciously understood how they shaped your life. It represents the insecurities you quietly compensate for, the disappointments you rarely speak about, and the invisible emotional injuries that continue influencing your choices, even when you believe you have already moved beyond them. The aspect connecting Venus and Chiron on this day is known as a quincunx. Unlike harmonious alignments that naturally blend two planetary energies together, the quincunx creates discomfort by forcing completely different energies into contact without offering an obvious solution. They cannot easily cooperate, yet neither can they ignore one another. Instead, they create persistent emotional friction, the kind that keeps drawing your attention back to something unresolved until you are finally willing to acknowledge it. I believe that for many people, what rises into awareness during this transit is not simply an old memory or a painful emotion. It is an entire relationship pattern that has quietly directed your love life for years. You may suddenly begin recognizing how often you have been attracted to people who seemed wounded, overwhelmed, emotionally unavailable, or somehow in need of saving. Perhaps you have consistently found yourself stepping into the role of the caretaker, the supporter, the problem solver, the person who remains strong while someone else falls apart. Maybe you offered endless patience because being needed made you feel valuable. Maybe you believed that if you loved hard enough, sacrificed enough, or carried enough responsibility, eventually the relationship would become secure. At first, this dynamic can feel noble. It can even feel meaningful, because helping another person often creates the comforting illusion of purpose. Yet beneath that generosity may exist something much more complicated. What very few people are willing to admit is that constantly rescuing others sometimes becomes a way of avoiding ourselves. When your attention is permanently focused on someone else's healing, you rarely have to sit with your own pain. When you become the one providing strength, guidance, and stability, you never have to fully acknowledge the places inside you that still feel frightened or broken. Remaining the healer can become an emotional strategy that protects you from experiencing your own vulnerability. Without realizing it, you may even maintain control within relationships, because as long as someone depends on you, you never have to risk revealing the parts of yourself that long to be cared for as well. This is the emotional blind spot that the quincunx between Venus and Chiron begins exposing. On August the 7th, that hidden pattern can become impossible to overlook. You may experience an uncomfortable internal conflict between the beautiful image you have tried to maintain in your relationships and the deeper emotional truth that has remained untouched beneath the surface. Suddenly, you begin sensing that something essential has never actually healed. For some people, that wound may revolve around self-worth, an old belief that love must be earned through usefulness instead of simply received. For others, it may reach even further back into experiences that taught them they would only be accepted if they constantly gave more than they received. Whatever form it takes, the discomfort arriving now is not punishment. It is exposure. And exposure is often the first requirement for genuine transformation. I do not believe this process will feel comfortable because real healing rarely begins with comfort. It begins the moment you become unable to deny what has always been there. Yet despite the emotional intensity, I believe this transit carries one of the greatest healing opportunities of the entire month. After all, no pattern can truly change while it remains invisible. Until you recognize it, you continue repeating it without understanding why the same disappointments appear again and again, wearing different faces. Venus and Chiron work together now to illuminate what has previously remained hidden, and they do so with remarkable clarity. If you've recently felt emotionally depleted inside a relationship, if it seems as though you've been carrying another person's fears, responsibilities, or emotional burdens while receiving very little support in return, this alignment may completely change the way you interpret that exhaustion. You may finally understand that your fatigue has never come from failing to do enough. Instead, it may have come from spending so much energy managing someone else's healing that you unintentionally abandoned your own. That realization may sting at first because it asks you to release an identity you have carried for a long time. Yet within that discomfort lies freedom. The moment you stop measuring your value by how much suffering you can absorb for another person, you create space for relationships built on mutual care instead of emotional imbalance. That shift prepares you for what unfolds next. Because once this inner awakening begins, the astrology quickly becomes even more powerful. In fact, the period arriving during the middle of August is one I keep returning to because it appears capable of dismantling nearly every illusion people have been carrying about love. Between August 10th and August 12th, an extraordinary sequence of planetary movements unfolds, creating one of the most emotionally significant relationship windows of the entire year. At the same time, it also has the potential to become one of the most destabilizing periods because truth and illusion arrive almost simultaneously. Everything begins on August the 10th when Venus forms a trine with Pluto. Then, only 4 hours later, Venus moves directly into an opposition with Neptune. On the following day, Venus completes another trine, this time with Uranus, while the solar eclipse in Leo continues building its influence in the background. Every one of these alignments contributes something essential to the emotional story unfolding during these days. The trine between Venus and Pluto opens the door to extraordinary emotional depth. Pluto rarely concerns itself with superficial attraction or temporary excitement. Instead, it reaches beneath appearances and uncovers what has been hidden. Under this influence, conversations can suddenly become far more intimate than expected. Emotional walls that have stood for years may begin falling away. Long-buried truths can emerge into the open. Connections that once seemed ordinary may suddenly reveal extraordinary intensity, almost as though another layer of the relationship has been quietly waiting to be discovered. If you are already involved with someone, you may feel your bond transforming into something much deeper than it was before, because honesty begins replacing emotional distance. Feelings that have remained beneath the surface for a long time finally demand expression, not to destroy the relationship, but to reshape it into something more authentic. If you are single, this transit may introduce someone whose presence reaches you on a level that feels impossible to explain logically. This is not merely physical attraction or fleeting excitement. It is the sensation that another person somehow recognizes parts of your inner world you have never fully shown anyone else. That is the unmistakable signature of Pluto, because Pluto is never interested in shallow experiences. Yet almost immediately after this profound opening occurs, the emotional atmosphere changes dramatically. Only a few hours later, Venus stands directly opposite Neptune. Neptune governs dreams, fantasy, imagination, idealization, and the seductive tendency to see what we hope exists instead of what is actually there. The contrast between these two planetary influences is remarkable. Pluto strips away appearances until only raw emotional truth remains. Neptune then arrives and begins surrounding that truth with uncertainty, emotion, longing, and illusion, creating the next chapter of this unfolding story. Neptune has a remarkable way of awakening the part of your heart that would rather believe in possibility than reality. It encourages you to imagine the version of a person you hope will eventually appear, instead of fully accepting the person standing in front of you today. It is the quiet voice that whispers that everything will become different if you simply wait a little longer, love a little harder, or remain patient a little more. Under Neptune's influence, dreams can become stronger than evidence, and hope can begin replacing honest observation. That is exactly why the opposition between Venus and Neptune carries such extraordinary emotional weight. An opposition places two planetary forces directly across from one another, each pulling your awareness toward completely different conclusions. One side insists on absolute honesty, while the other tempts you back into comforting illusion. During this period, I believe many people are going to experience a deeply personal moment that feels almost impossible to forget. For a brief instant, You may look at your relationship with complete clarity. Every excuse disappears. Every emotional filter falls away. You recognize what has truly been happening without trying to soften it or explain it away. You see the connection exactly as it exists, rather than as you have hoped it might become. Yet almost immediately after that realization arrives, another emotional current begins pulling in the opposite direction. Doubt quietly returns. You may find yourself wondering whether you judged the situation too harshly. You may hear your own mind suggesting that perhaps things are not really as serious as they seemed only moments earlier. Perhaps they will eventually become the person you have been waiting for. Perhaps you are simply overanalyzing everything. It may feel confusing at first, but I do not believe confusion is the real purpose of this transit. I believe something much deeper is taking place. The universe first allows you to witness the truth without distortion, and then it gently asks a question that only you can answer. Are you finally willing to trust what you have seen, or will you retreat into the version of reality that feels emotionally safer, even if it is no longer true? That choice becomes especially significant because another extraordinary alignment follows almost immediately. On August 11th, Venus completes a grand air trine with Uranus and Pluto. This formation introduces an entirely different quality of awareness. If Neptune creates mist, the grand air trine functions almost like a powerful wind clearing the entire sky. The uncertainty that seemed overwhelming only hours before begins disappearing, leaving behind a level of understanding that feels unmistakable. Truth no longer arrives in fragments. It becomes direct, unmistakable, and surprisingly liberating. For some relationships, this period may become incredibly challenging, because connections that have survived primarily through fantasy, projection, or imagined potential may suddenly lose the foundation that has been holding them together. When a relationship depends more upon who someone might become than who they consistently choose to be, the illusion can unravel with remarkable speed during this window. I believe it is important to acknowledge that possibility honestly, because not every connection is meant to continue unchanged after profound truth arrives. Yet this same astrological pattern offers something incredibly beautiful for relationships grounded in authenticity. When honesty replaces illusion, emotional intimacy gains the opportunity to deepen in ways that were previously impossible. Without unrealistic expectations covering the surface, two people can finally meet one another exactly where they are. That kind of connection carries a different quality altogether. It is not sustained by fantasy or wishful thinking. It is built through genuine recognition, emotional transparency, and the willingness to be fully seen without hiding behind carefully constructed images. In many ways, that is the kind of love countless people search for throughout their entire lives, because it asks for nothing except truth. If you have remained with me until this point, I truly appreciate it, because the next development in this astrological sequence reveals something that surprised me while studying these alignments. Initially, all of my attention remained focused on the emotional transformations, the powerful influence of Pluto, and the profound psychological changes unfolding throughout the month. Then another pattern began standing out with equal importance, perhaps even greater importance for the future health of long-term relationships. Between August 11th and August 12th, Venus traveling through Libra, Uranus moving through Gemini, and Pluto positioned in Aquarius create what astrologers call a grand air trine. As if that were not already significant enough, Mercury in Leo then forms a sextile with Venus, completing a larger geometric pattern known as a double kite configuration. Those names may sound highly technical, yet the experience they describe is surprisingly practical and deeply personal. Air signs govern communication, understanding, ideas, curiosity, perspective, and the mental exchange that allows two people to truly know one another beyond physical attraction or emotional intensity alone. When this much harmonious air energy becomes active simultaneously, something remarkable begins happening inside conversations themselves. Words that previously refused to come forward suddenly arrive with unexpected ease. Subjects that have remained untouched for months may finally feel safe enough to explore. Questions that lingered silently beneath the surface begin finding expression naturally rather than through conflict or frustration. This flow is made even more dynamic because Uranus participates directly in the pattern. Uranus rarely supports routine or predictable interactions. Instead, it introduces originality, disruption, breakthroughs, and completely unexpected insights. During this window, the conversations you have may surprise even you. You could discover yourself revealing feelings you never imagined speaking aloud. Your partner may express an idea that completely changes the way you interpret your shared future. A discussion about commitment, dreams, priorities, or the direction of your relationship may unfold in ways neither of you anticipated, because the usual limitations around communication begin dissolving. It can feel as though both people are finally speaking from a place that has remained inaccessible until now. Mercury's involvement from Leo adds another essential dimension to this experience. Rather than creating detached or purely intellectual conversations, Mercury in Leo fills these exchanges with warmth, sincerity, courage, and emotional presence. Thoughts become heartfelt rather than distant. Honesty becomes compassionate rather than harsh. Instead of simply exchanging information, two people begin sharing parts of themselves with greater openness. These are the kinds of conversations that remain in your memory long after they end, because they create genuine understanding rather than temporary agreement. I believe this period has the potential to become one of the most exciting opportunities of the month for couples willing to embrace it fully. Lasting relationships are not sustained only by attraction or chemistry, powerful as those qualities may be. Over time, what allows two people to continue growing together is the ability to keep discovering one another intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. When both partners remain genuinely curious about each other's inner worlds, the relationship continues evolving instead of becoming stagnant. This remarkable sequence of planetary alignments opens that possibility with unusual strength. If you have recently felt as though you and your partner have been simply moving through daily routines instead of truly connecting, this window offers an opportunity to change that dynamic completely. The invitation is there, but it requires participation. The breakthrough cannot happen without the willingness to speak honestly, to listen openly, and to step into conversations that perhaps should have happened long ago. The only thing this extraordinary energy cannot do for you is speak in your place. It can open the doorway, soften emotional defenses, and create the perfect conditions for understanding. But the words themselves still have to come from your own heart. If there has been something you have been carrying in silence, something you have postponed because it felt too uncomfortable or too risky to express, this is the moment when remaining silent may cost more than speaking honestly. The current alignments are offering a rare chance to rebuild the mental and emotional framework of your relationship from the ground up, and opportunities like this do not appear often. That is why I believe it is so important not to let this period pass without using it. Earlier, I mentioned one particular transit that continued capturing my attention above all the others, and now we have arrived at it. Out of every alignment taking place this month, I believe the events surrounding August 21st carry the greatest potential to determine the future direction of many relationships. If there is one moment capable of revealing whether a connection possesses the strength to endure what life will eventually demand of it, this is the one. Before that test arrives, however, the universe offers something remarkably beautiful. On August 17th, Venus forms a harmonious sextile with Jupiter in Leo. After everything that has unfolded during the previous 2 weeks, after the emotional recalibration, the healing, the difficult realizations, and the transformative conversations, this alignment feels almost like a deep breath after climbing an exhausting mountain. Jupiter expands whatever it touches, and when it harmonizes with Venus, the emotional atmosphere becomes noticeably lighter. Joy returns. Appreciation becomes easier to express. Generosity flows naturally. You may find yourself looking at your partner with renewed gratitude, remembering why this relationship mattered in the first place. Optimism begins replacing uncertainty, and the future suddenly appears filled with possibility instead of hesitation. There is warmth, laughter, affection, and a renewed sense that perhaps everything you have worked through has brought you somewhere meaningful. It is one of the most heart-opening combinations of the year, because it reminds you what healthy love feels like when two people genuinely enjoy sharing their lives together. Yet the story does not end there. Only 4 days later, on August 21st, the emotional landscape changes once again as Venus moves into a direct opposition with Saturn. The contrast between Jupiter and Saturn could hardly be more dramatic. Where Jupiter encourages expansion, Saturn demands structure. Where Jupiter celebrates hope, Saturn insists upon responsibility. Jupiter asks you to dream, while Saturn asks whether those dreams can survive reality. Saturn has little interest in promises that exist only in imagination. It is concerned with endurance, consistency, accountability, and the quiet choices people make every day after excitement begins fading. This is why I believe the opposition between Venus and Saturn becomes such a defining moment. It is not designed to punish love. It is designed to measure its foundation. During this transit, relationships may suddenly feel heavier than they did only days before. The effortless optimism of the Jupiter sextile may seem to disappear, replaced by a much more serious emotional atmosphere. You and your partner could experience moments of distance, not necessarily because love has disappeared, but because reality begins demanding attention. Daily responsibilities, long-term commitments, practical concerns, financial questions, future plans, and unresolved differences may suddenly feel impossible to ignore. If the relationship contains weaknesses that have been covered by avoidance, convenience, or fear of loneliness, Saturn has a remarkable ability to illuminate every one of those hidden fractures. Although this process can feel uncomfortable, I do not believe it is an act of cruelty. Instead, I see it as an expression of profound wisdom. A relationship cannot become truly lasting until it has demonstrated that it can carry the weight of real life. Passion alone cannot sustain a partnership if it collapses the moment difficulties appear. Chemistry by itself cannot resolve disagreements about commitment, shared responsibilities, financial realities, or the direction two lives are meant to travel together. Saturn quietly asks a question that cannot be avoided. Is this relationship capable of supporting the future both of you hope to build? That question requires extraordinary honesty. It asks both partners to move beyond romantic fantasies and hopeful assumptions, and examine the relationship exactly as it exists today. Can you remain present during the ordinary seasons as faithfully as you do during the exciting ones? Can you continue choosing one another when life feels repetitive, demanding, or exhausting? Are both people equally willing to invest effort even when love feels more like discipline than inspiration? These are not glamorous questions, yet they are the ones that determine whether a relationship becomes temporary or enduring. One pattern I have noticed repeatedly is that couples who approach this transit with courage often emerge stronger than they entered it. Saturn certainly tests what has been built, but it also strengthens whatever proves capable of withstanding that pressure. Commitments formed or renewed under this influence carry unusual resilience because they have already survived contact with reality. There is a different kind of confidence that develops after two people honestly confront difficult truths and still choose one another. That confidence cannot be created through fantasy because it has already been verified through experience. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge that not every relationship will continue beyond this period, and if that becomes your experience, I hope you will not interpret it as personal failure. Sometimes Saturn reveals that a chapter has reached its natural conclusion because your energy is being redirected toward a healthier future. While that realization may bring sadness, it may also become an act of compassion that frees both people to continue growing in the direction they were always meant to follow. This is why I believe the events unfolding throughout August are far more than isolated astrological moments. Together they create an unfolding journey with a much larger purpose. On August 12th, the very day Venus completes the grand air trine, a solar eclipse takes place in Leo. Eclipses rarely limit their influence to a single day or even a single week. Instead, they often establish a trajectory that continues unfolding across the following 6 months. That means the choices you make about love during this period, the conversations you finally decide to have, the relationships you begin nurturing, or the ones you courageously release, are unlikely to remain temporary experiences. They become part of a much longer story that continues shaping your emotional future well beyond this month. Then, as August approaches its conclusion, another powerful transition arrives. On August 28th, a lunar eclipse in Pisces brings an extraordinary emotional release. Everything that has accumulated throughout the month, every difficult realization, every uncomfortable truth, every hidden feeling finally brought into the light, begins moving through you instead of remaining trapped within you. This eclipse creates an opportunity to release what no longer belongs in your emotional life. Old resentment may finally lose its grip. Long-carried grief may begin softening. Expectations about love that were never truly serving you may finally dissolve. You may discover that what you once believed you wanted was actually preventing you from receiving something far more authentic. Between these two eclipses, another profound collective shift also takes place as the lunar nodes move into an entirely new Pisces and Virgo axis. That transition signals a broader change in the direction collective growth is encouraging. The emphasis gradually moves away from excessive analysis, constant control, and the exhausting belief that every relationship must be repaired through endless effort. Instead, humanity is invited toward deeper compassion, greater empathy, stronger spiritual awareness, and a form of love that values authenticity over perfection. Rather than trying to control every outcome, we are encouraged to trust emotional honesty. Rather than believing love must always be earned through endless sacrifice, we are reminded that genuine connection can exist without constant performance. Looking at everything together, I truly believe August 2026 will become one of those rare periods that many people remember long after it has passed. Not because life suddenly changed without your participation, but because the universe presented repeated opportunities to see clearly, choose courageously, and embrace the kind of love that genuinely reflects your worth. If you have spent too long accepting less than you deserve, giving endlessly without receiving, holding tightly to fantasies that no longer match reality, or avoiding conversations that could transform your future, this month invites you to make a different choice. That invitation may not always feel comfortable, yet it arrives because you are finally prepared to answer it. Before we finish, I simply want to thank you for spending this time with me. I know this has been an incredibly in-depth exploration, and I truly appreciate that you stayed all the way to the end. If these insights spoke to your heart, and you would like to continue exploring astrology and spiritual growth together in future videos, I would be deeply grateful if you chose to subscribe. Your support helps this community continue growing in ways you may not even realize. I would also love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because every person's journey through these alignments is unique. Tell me, what has already begun changing in your life? What emotions have been surfacing for you, and how you are experiencing this powerful season? I read every message, and I genuinely believe there is something deeply meaningful about witnessing these transformations together. Until next time, be gentle with yourself, Continue trusting your own inner wisdom, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.